In this video, you will follow the incredible journey of Emma, a woman marked by a painful past that she has never been able to overcome, until now. After the tragic loss of her father and years of a cold relationship with her mother, Emma built a solitary life, filled with work and routines that kept her isolated. But when a new co-worker, Jake, comes along and awakens feelings Emma has long avoided, everything begins to change. Will she be able to open up to love and finally free herself from the shadows of the past? As time goes on, Emma is forced to confront her deepest fears and the truths she has avoided for so long. In a series of emotional revelations and unexpected encounters, she uncovers letters and secrets that offer a new perspective on her childhood and her relationship with her mother. How will these discoveries change the way she sees her life? As Emma deals with the decision to forgive and move forward, an unexpected invitation from Jake opens the door to something much bigger. But is she ready for this new chapter in her life? Or will fear continue to dictate her choices? In the end, Emma will have to make a decision that will define not only her future, but also the future of everyone around her. Stay until the end to find out how this story of love, redemption, and overcoming can deeply touch your heart. The unexpected conclusion will leave you wondering, how far are we willing to go to find true peace? Emma Larkin woke up every day at 6:30 in the morning. The alarm clock rang in the same rhythm. The morning light filtered through the blinds of her apartment in Boston, and the world continued to spin, oblivious to the monotonous and predictable cycle that defined her existence. Emma had built her life around a rigid routine where every minute was planned and each day was a repetition of the last. There were no surprises, no unforeseen events. The journey from home to work, the silent office, the spreadsheets she filled out with obsessive precision, all of this was her comfort zone, a cocoon that protected her from the chaos of the outside world. But this routine, which seemed so safe, hid a deep trauma that shaped every choice Emma made. 15 years ago, a car accident took her father's life. The impact of that loss was devastating. Emma's father was her safe harbor, the only one who seemed to understand her. On that fateful day, he was on his way to a last-ditch attempt to reconcile with his wife, Emma's mother, after a series of disagreements that had driven the family apart. Emma, then a teenager, refused to go with him, staying home, angry and hurt, believing it would just be another fight. But fate was cruel. The news of the accident came hours later, tearing apart any sense of security Emma might have had. Guilt gnawed at her since then, making her believe that somehow she was responsible for her father's death. If she had gone with him, if she had tried to help, maybe things would have been different. This guilt became a constant shadow, and Emma, unable to cope with the pain, closed herself off from the world, avoiding any emotional connection that could open new wounds. Control became her defense mechanism, and the spreadsheets, the only thing she could keep organized in her chaotic and emotionally fragmented life. That particular morning, the office was more bustling than usual. The chatter of voices and laughter echoed through the hallways, a sound that sharply contrasted with the contained silence of the place. It was Margaret's last day, the oldest secretary in the company, who was retiring. Margaret had always been a motherly figure to everyone, known for her patience and wisdom. She was the only person in the office who occasionally tried to break down Emma's barriers, but always with a light touch that Emma found difficult to repel. During the farewell party, everyone gathered in the conference room. Emma stayed in a corner, trying to be as invisible as possible. She had never liked these social gatherings, and that morning, her discomfort was at an all-time high. However, Margaret noticed her, as she always did. At the end of the speeches, the elderly woman decided to speak once more, and her words were as unexpected as they were cutting.
Emma, dear,
Margaret began, looking directly at her.
I want to tell you something I've never had the courage to say before. You've always been the most solitary person I've ever known. I hope with all my heart that you find something or someone who can break this barrier and bring a little light into your life. Because, my dear, you deserve it more than you can imagine.
Margaret's words resonated like an echo in Emma's mind. Everyone in the room turned their eyes toward her, and for a moment, Emma felt as if she were exposed, naked before all. Her loneliness, which she had always considered a well-guarded secret, was visible to all. She could no longer pretend that she was okay. The blow was unexpected and deep, leaving her stunned. Margaret had said what no one had ever dared to say, and the raw truth of her words hit Emma like a punch. That night, Emma returned home feeling more vulnerable than ever. Margaret's words echoed in her mind as she walked through the empty apartment, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to engulf her. She had always known, deep down, that her life was marked by loneliness, but having it exposed so openly and by someone she respected was a shock. Margaret, with her soft voice and gentle manners, had ripped away the mask that Emma had worn for so long. Trying to distract herself, Emma went to the kitchen, made some tea, and sat down on the sofa in the living room. But the emptiness around her seemed to grow with each passing minute. Memories of her father started flooding her mind. The image of the accident, which she had always tried to push away, came rushing back with full force. She felt her heart race, her breath grow short. In a desperate impulse, she picked up the phone and, without much thought, dialed Margaret's number. The phone rang once, twice, before Emma, in a pure panic act, hung up. She couldn't do it. She couldn't open up, even to Margaret. Tears began to fall silently as she curled up on the sofa, feeling more alone than ever. The panic attack that followed was inevitable. Emma felt her chest tighten, the air leave her lungs, and despair take over her being. She was trapped in a cycle she didn't know how to break. That night, while the city slept outside, Emma faced the demons that had haunted her since her father's death. Loneliness, guilt, the fear of connecting with someone again. It was all there, piled on top of her, suffocating her. And yet, amid all that pain, Emma realized that for the first time in a long time, she wanted something different. She wanted to climb out of that abyss. But the path to that change was still dark and frightening, and Emma knew it wouldn't be easy. But perhaps, just perhaps, Margaret's words had planted a seed, and the desire for change was beginning to sprout. At 12 years old, Emma was already an introspective child, always preferring the company of books to the noise of street games. Her world revolved around the safe silence of the house she shared with her parents. But the peace of this small refuge was shattered the day her parents began to argue constantly. Emma's father, John, was a kind man but lost amid the expectations the world had of him. Her mother, Evelyn, was a rigid and practical woman, unable to deal with her husband's fragilities. Emma, still so young, didn't know how to act between the two. She loved her father deeply, but as the arguments intensified, she felt increasingly distant from him. At that time, all Emma wanted was to avoid the discomfort of the fights. She would shut herself in her room, trying to ignore the voices rising from the disputes in the living room. It was during one of those arguments that Evelyn decided to leave the house and stay a few days at her mother's. John tried to convince Evelyn to come back, but one day everything changed. It was a Saturday morning. John decided he could no longer live in an environment devoid of love, especially for his daughter. He had decided to leave and try to reconcile with Evelyn and asked Emma to go with him, perhaps hoping that his daughter's presence could soften Evelyn's heart. But Emma refused. Tired of feeling trapped in her parents' disputes, with the anger and frustration of a teenager, she decided she didn't want to be part of that drama anymore.
"I'm not going, Dad. I'm tired of this,"
Emma said, not even looking him in the eye. John hesitated for a moment but ended up leaving alone. Hours later, Emma received the news that would change her life forever. Her father had been in an accident and didn't survive. The guilt Emma carried since that moment was immense. If she had gone with him, perhaps the accident wouldn't have happened. Maybe she could have convinced him to give up on winning Evelyn back, or at least to take another route. But she stayed, and he never returned. This guilt shaped every aspect of Emma's life. She built walls around her heart, fearing that any new emotional connection could lead to another tragedy. The coldness she displayed that day became her way of operating in life, a form of self-protection against more pain. She pushed away everyone who tried to get close, and this self-imposed loneliness became both a punishment and a shield. Emma's present was a shadow of her past. Her life was composed of a meticulously planned routine where every minute was counted. She woke up early, went for a morning run, had coffee with almost military precision, and headed to work. At the office, Emma was known for her unquestionable efficiency, but also for her coldness. She limited herself to work, refusing colleagues' invitations to grab coffee or have lunch outside. Any deviation from this routine was enough to trigger an almost paralyzing anxiety. That morning, however, one of her co-workers, Jenny, insisted on inviting her for coffee. She was new to the company and didn't yet know Emma's reputation.
"Emma, you should come with us. It'll be fun,"
she said with a sincere smile. Emma's heart raced. She shook her head almost without thinking, mumbling some excuse. But internally, anxiety took over. What if she went and didn't know what to say? What if someone asked questions about her personal life? The mere thought of stepping out of that comfort zone made her stomach churn. She retreated even further into her shell, returning to the safety of her desk and the spreadsheets that, at least, she could control. This rigid routine, far from bringing peace, was Emma's way of avoiding any situation that could bring back the pain of the past. With each declined invitation, each missed opportunity for social interaction, Emma reinforced the walls of the cocoon she lived in. She was safe, but she was also isolated. And the weight of that isolation became increasingly suffocating, an invisible burden she carried with her every day. Work was Emma's last refuge, the only place where she felt she had some control. The spreadsheets, reports, and repetitive tasks, these all gave her a sense of stability that she couldn't find in any other aspect of her life. But that afternoon, something broke within her. Perhaps it was Jenny's insistence, or maybe Margaret's speech from the previous day still echoed in her mind. But while reviewing an important spreadsheet, Emma made a mistake. It was a simple error, but in her mind, it felt monumental. The numbers didn't add up, and Emma couldn't find the problem. Her fingers began to tremble, sweat trickled down her forehead, and her breathing grew increasingly shallow. The pressure she placed on herself, the need for perfection, became unbearable. For the first time in years, Emma felt her world crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The mistake on the spreadsheet was something she could have corrected in a few minutes, but her mind was trapped in a cycle of self-criticism.
How could you be so stupid? How can you be so incompetent?
Those words echoed in her head until anxiety finally paralyzed her completely. Emma knew it was more than just a work mistake. It was the weight of the past, the guilt, the unresolved pain, finally breaking down the defenses she had built over the years. Emma abruptly stood up and went to the bathroom, where she locked herself in one of the stalls. There, she finally allowed herself to succumb to panic. Tears came, and with them, the realization that her life, which she thought was under control, was on the verge of collapse. For the first time, Emma understood that she could no longer continue this way. The walls she had erected to protect herself were crumbling, and what would be left of her when everything fell apart? She didn't know the answer, but at that moment she knew she needed to find out. The morning after her collapse in the bathroom, Emma arrived at the office trying to keep her composure. The feeling of being on the brink of a breakdown still lingered, but she forced herself to follow the routine. There was something comforting in the predictability of work, even if that security was beginning to crumble. As she sat down at her desk, she noticed an unusual commotion in the office. A new employee had arrived, and he was not just anyone. He was Margaret's replacement, the new team supervisor. Jake Hargrove, a man in his mid-30s, entered the room with an easy smile and a confidence that immediately captured everyone's attention. He was tall, with slightly disheveled brown hair and a warm gaze that exuded approachability. Something about his posture, perhaps the way he greeted everyone with a combination of respect and camaraderie, reminded Emma of her father. This resemblance unsettled her, bringing to the surface memories she had buried deep. As Jake introduced himself to the few employees, Emma observed from a distance, trying to avoid his gaze. But inevitably, Jake's eyes found hers. There was something in his look that disarmed her. She expected the clinical gaze of a supervisor, but what she found was genuine interest, almost warmth, as if he wanted to truly get to know her and not just see her as a cog in the company machine. That brief, silent moment between them disturbed Emma more than she was willing to admit. She quickly averted her gaze, feeling her heart race with a mix of panic and an emotion she couldn't identify. Jake's presence, so different yet so familiar, activated something within Emma. It was as if he brought to the surface emotions she had suppressed for so long. The carefully controlled world she had built was beginning to show more cracks, and Jake was the embodiment of those fissures. The blend of fear and attraction she felt confused her and left her anxious, awakening feelings she thought she had buried along with her past. Throughout the week, Jake quickly established himself as a charismatic and competent supervisor. He had a unique way of making everyone feel comfortable, and his friendly approach soon won over most of the employees. However, for Emma, his presence continued to be a constant reminder of the things she preferred to forget. That Friday, Jake finally approached Emma's desk, determined to get to know her better.
Emma, right?
He asked with the same warm smile.
I'm trying to familiarize myself with the work here, and it seems like you're one of the people keeping things running.
Emma, surprised by the direct approach, tried to hide her discomfort.
I do my job.
She replied, in a tone that sounded colder than she intended. Jake didn't let that deter him. He continued to chat, mentioning how new he was to the city and how he was trying to adapt. Unknowingly, he touched on a wound that Emma kept well hidden.
Sometimes, being in a new place makes me think about how our parents influence us, the way they shape us, even when we're not aware of it.
Those words hit Emma hard. She tried to maintain her composure but felt her chest tighten. The mention of parents, Jake's sincere tone, all of it brought to the surface the pain and guilt she struggled to repress. Emma shook her head and replied almost automatically,
Yeah, I guess so.
but her voice faltered, and she knew she couldn't keep that conversation going for much longer. Jake, noticing the change in Emma's demeanor, softened his tone even more.
Sorry if I touched on a sensitive topic,
He said, showing a kindness that left her even more unsettled. Instead of backing away, he drew closer, almost imperceptibly, not physically, but emotionally, trying to establish a genuine connection. For Emma, that was too much. She immediately recoiled, murmuring something about having too much work to do, and turned her attention back to her computer screen, hoping Jake would understand the message and leave her alone. He hesitated for a second, but soon smiled understandingly and stepped back, respecting the space she valued so much. But that interaction, brief as it was, left Emma shaken, not only because Jake had touched on a painful subject, but because he hadn't reacted like most people would, with withdrawal or indifference. Instead, he showed understanding and tried to get closer, and that scared her more than she would like to admit. After that first conversation with Jake, something changed inside Emma. She found herself thinking about him more often than she wanted, and each time she did, she was overwhelmed by a mix of conflicting feelings. There was an undeniable attraction, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The way he looked at her as if he could see beyond the cold facade she maintained made Emma feel seen in a way she wasn't used to. But this attraction came with a crushing fear. Whenever she thought of Jake, a voice in her head warned her of the danger of getting too close. What would happen if she opened up? If she allowed someone to get close to her? The fear of reliving the pain of losing her father, the guilt and the feeling of helplessness. All those feelings surged back with full force. Emma knew that if she allowed herself to feel something for Jake, she would be risking a lot. More than that, she would be opening the doors to a pain she had worked so hard to keep locked away. With each work message she received from him, Emma felt her heart race in a way she couldn't control. There was something comforting about his way of communicating, a balance between professionalism and warmth that intrigued her. But that feeling also terrified her. Behind every message, no matter how innocent, Emma sensed the possibility of a deeper involvement, and that made her pull back. Over the following weeks, this internal battle between desire and fear began to consume her. Emma started avoiding Jake more than necessary, but she couldn't ignore the moments when she encountered him in the hallways or in meetings. Each accidental meeting was an emotional roller coaster, where fear and attraction fought for control. And for the first time in a long time, Emma began to question whether she was willing to continue living this way, alone, protected, but trapped in a prison of her own making. Jake's mere presence, the possibility of something more, awakened in Emma a series of emotions she thought she had forgotten. This confusion made her question how much she was willing to risk for a chance at human connection. But at the same time, the idea of opening up and potentially suffering again was almost unbearable. Emma stood at the brink of an emotional crossroads, knowing that any choice she made would have profound consequences in her life, for better or for worse. The interaction with Jake continued to reverberate in Emma's mind. She couldn't stop thinking about the way he looked at her, as if he could see beyond the cold facade she had carefully maintained. His kind words, the understanding he demonstrated, all of it triggered a spiral of anxiety that Emma could not control. In the days that followed, the anxiety intensified to the point where her once unshakable routine began to crumble. Emma felt her heart race every time she thought of Jake, and the sensation of losing control became increasingly unbearable. It was then that Emma realized she could not continue like this. The weight of anxiety was crushing her, and for the first time in a long time, she found herself considering asking for help. However, the idea of seeking a therapist terrified her. Exposing her vulnerabilities to a stranger was an impossible thought. Instead, Emma remembered Margaret, her former colleague and one of the few people she trusted. Margaret always had a warm way about her, a kind of wisdom that made Emma feel safe, even in the most difficult moments. Summoning her courage, Emma decided to call Margaret. The phone rang 3 times before being answered by the warm and familiar voice she so desperately needed to hear.
Emma, dear, what a nice surprise to hear from you.
Margaret exclaimed. Emma's voice faltered for a moment, but she managed to find the words.
Margaret, I think I need to talk to you. Do you have some time?
Margaret immediately agreed, suggesting they meet at a small cafe they both used to frequent. The next day, Emma arrived at the place with her heart racing. Margaret was already there, smiling as always. When Emma sat down, Margaret took her hand, gently squeezing it.
What's going on, Emma?
She asked, concern evident in her eyes. The words came out of Emma with difficulty, as if each one were stuck in her throat. She spoke about the anxiety she felt, about Jake, and about the painful memories of her father that had been reignited. She talked about the guilt she had carried since childhood and the paralyzing fear of opening up to another person, fearing it could lead to more pain and loss. Margaret listened attentively, without interrupting, just offering her comforting presence.
Emma,
Margaret began when her friend finished.
you carry so much weight on your shoulders, but you don't have to do this alone. Sometimes we need to allow ourselves to be vulnerable to find healing.
Margaret's words resonated deeply within Emma. For the first time, she felt that maybe it was possible to share her pain and, with that, relieve some of the burden she carried. The conversation with Margaret left Emma with an unexpected sense of lightness. It was as if, by opening up, she had allowed a breath of fresh air into her stagnant life. Inspired by this new perspective, Emma began to consider the possibility of letting her barriers down, even if just a little. The opportunity arose sooner than she expected when, that same week, Jake invited her for coffee after work. Normally, Emma would have immediately declined, but Margaret's words still echoed in her mind, encouraging her to try.
Sure, why not?
Emma replied, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. Jake smiled, visibly pleased, and they arranged to meet at a nearby cafe. As the day went on, Emma's anxiety grew, but this time there was something different. Instead of succumbing to panic, she tried to focus on Margaret's words, reminding herself that it was possible to face her fears. At the cafe, Jake arrived before her and was already sitting at a table in the back, near the window. When he saw her, he waved, and Emma felt her heart race. As she sat down, she noticed her hands trembling slightly. They began to chat, initially about trivial matters: work, movies, places they would like to visit. But as time passed, Jake began to share something more personal. He talked about his own father, a stern man who was never very affectionate, and how that shaped his search for approval throughout life. Jake's words touched an open wound in Emma. She struggled to stay calm, but emotions began to bubble up. The similarities between their stories left her unsettled. What if, by getting closer to someone, she ended up repeating the mistakes of the past? Fear began to take hold, and Emma felt the overwhelming need to flee. The walls she had built were threatened to come crashing down, and the dread of being hurt again was unbearable.
I'm sorry. I need to go.
Emma said abruptly, barely managing to maintain her composure. Jake looked at her with surprise and concern, but he didn't try to stop her. He simply nodded, respecting her space. Emma left the cafe almost running, her heart racing and her mind in turmoil. She knew she had taken an important step by accepting the invitation, but she also realized how much she was still trapped by the past. The internal battle between the desire to open up and the fear of getting hurt continued, and Emma didn't know how to deal with it. Upon arriving home, still trying to calm her nerves, Emma received an unexpected call. It was her mother, Evelyn, with whom she had little contact. The relationship between the two had always been difficult, filled with resentments and prolonged silences. Emma hesitated before answering, but the worry in her voice was palpable.
Emma, I'm sick.
Evelyn said, her voice weak. Emma felt a knot form in her throat.
What happened, Mom?
She asked, anxiety rising once again. Evelyn explained that she had been diagnosed with a serious condition and needed support. The news hit Emma like a punch. The memory of her father and the coldness with which she had treated him in his final moments came flooding back. Now, her mother, the only family she had left, was sick, and Emma found herself facing a difficult choice. The duty to care for Evelyn called to her, but the resentment she still carried weighed as heavily as ever. Margaret's words echoed in her mind once more. Perhaps this was the opportunity to confront her fears, to try to heal old wounds. But the thought of going back to her mother's house, of dealing with painful memories and guilt, was daunting. Emma felt suffocated by family expectations and her own uncertainty about how to handle this new crisis. She knew that going there meant reopening old wounds, but ignoring the situation also filled her with guilt.
I'll go, Mom.
Emma finally said, her voice trembling. As she hung up the phone, a new wave of emotions washed over her. Emma was on the verge of facing what would likely be the greatest emotional challenge of her life. For the first time, she felt she could not run away or hide. Confronting the past was inevitable, and somehow she knew that this meeting with her mother could change everything. The news of her mother Evelyn's illness left Emma in a state of numbness. The phone conversation echoed in her mind, filled with doubts and insecurities. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was a test, a chance to confront all the ghosts that had haunted her since childhood. But fear and resentment still held her back, preventing her from making a clear decision. That night felt long and endless. Emma tossed and turned in bed, her eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, while her brain forced her to revisit memories she had long tried to forget. She thought of the lonely nights of her adolescence, when she hid in her room to avoid hearing the fights between her parents. She remembered her mother's face, always so cold, so distant, as if any display of affection was a weakness. Evelyn was a practical, tough woman who always prioritized survival over love. And Emma, learning from her mother's example, began to internalize that emotions were dangerous, that showing weakness meant opening herself up to suffering. That emotional coldness that Evelyn cultivated was what drove John, Emma's father, away. And it was the same that Emma, unknowingly, began to replicate in her own life. As the night wore on, the memories became increasingly painful. Emma found herself reliving moments when she desperately wished for a little affection, a gesture of tenderness from her mother, which never came. This distance, she finally realized, shaped her own emotional reclusiveness. She spent years avoiding relationships, avoiding deep connections, all to protect herself from reliving the pain of being rejected again. But now, facing the possible loss of her mother, Emma understood that there was something even worse than the fear of suffering, the regret of never having tried. Emma spent that night wide awake, reflecting on what lay ahead. The vulnerability she felt when talking to Jake and opening up to Margaret now seemed minuscule compared to what awaited her. The revelation of her mother's illness forced Emma to confront the traumas that shaped her, and she had no idea how she would emerge from this situation. All she knew was that she could no longer continue living as before, and that the choices she made in the coming days would have profound consequences, not only for her relationship with her mother, but also for her own ability to connect with the world. When the first light of morning entered through the cracks in the window, Emma came to a conclusion. She could no longer run away. She was tired of living in fear, tired of being a hostage to the wounds of the past. She decided that, despite all the fear and resentment, she needed to confront her feelings and see her mother. This was the only way to attempt to heal the wounds that tormented her so much, and maybe, just maybe, find some peace. The decision was not easy, but it was the only one that made sense in that moment. Emma got up, feeling exhausted but determined. The next day would be a new beginning, one way or another. The day began like any other at the office, but for Emma, everything felt different. The decision to confront her past and face her mother loomed over her, bringing a constant tension that she couldn't shake off. Her mind was distracted, thoughts racing in circles, and even the simplest tasks felt immense. Jake, who had been observing Emma from a distance, noticed the changes in her behavior. There was something wrong, something that deeply troubled the woman he was just beginning to know. Around noon, Jake decided to approach her.
Emma, do you have a minute?
He asked, trying to keep his tone light, but his concern was evident. Emma, so lost in her thoughts, barely heard him. When she finally looked up, she found Jake's attentive gaze, which seemed to be trying to understand what was going on inside her.
I noticed you seem a bit different today. Is everything okay?
The question, simple and genuine, broke something inside Emma.
I'm fine, Jake.
She lied, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Jake, sensing the fragility in her words, didn't back down.
Emma, you know you can talk to me, right? Whatever it is, I'm here.
He said, his tone calm yet firm. It was in that moment that Emma lost control. The pressure of everything she had been feeling, the tension of the decision she had made, and the simple act of someone showing concern for her all mixed into an internal storm.
You don't understand, Jake.
She started, her voice louder than she intended.
You don't know what it's like to live with this damn guilt, what it's like to carry a weight that feels like it will never go away. I'm trying, but it's so hard.
The words spilled out uncontrollably. She spoke about her mother's illness, about the past that haunted her, about how she felt so terribly trapped and alone. Jake listened in silence, not interrupting, not judging her. When Emma finally stopped speaking, breathing heavily, he stepped forward and, with the gentleness he always showed, said,
You're stronger than you realize, Emma, and you're not alone. I'm here, and if you need space, I'll give it to you. But know that you don't have to face this all by yourself.
Jake's words, instead of pushing Emma away, drew her closer to him. For the first time, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she could trust someone beyond herself. After the outburst with Jake, Emma felt a mix of relief and vulnerability. She had never exposed herself like that to anyone, and the experience was as liberating as it was terrifying. But somehow, Jake's words, the understanding he demonstrated, helped her find a little more courage within herself. Now, the decision she needed to make seemed clearer, though no less frightening. Emma knew she had to face her mother and deal with everything she had avoided for so long. At the end of the workday, Emma approached Jake again.
Thank you for today.
She said with a shy but genuine smile.
I'm going to visit my mother. I need to do this.
Jake, who was organizing some papers, stopped and looked at her with a mix of pride and concern.
I'm glad you made that decision. But remember, Emma, you don't have to do this alone. If you need anything, I'll be here,
he replied. With Jake's support and Margaret's encouraging words still fresh in her mind, Emma began making preparations for the trip. She would travel to the town where she grew up, to the house where all those memories still lived within the walls. The thought of returning to that place filled her with anxiety, but also with a strange sense of resolution, as if she were finally allowing herself to heal the open wounds. That night, before packing her bags, Emma called Margaret.
I'm going to do it, Margaret. I'm going to see my mother,
she said, her voice firmer than she expected. Margaret smiled on the other end of the line, though Emma couldn't see her.
I'm proud of you, Emma. I know it's not easy, but it's what needs to be done. You're stronger than you think.
Margaret's farewell was brief but filled with meaning. After hanging up the phone, Emma allowed herself a moment of silence. She knew this trip wouldn't be easy. She knew she would have to confront not only her mother, but also all the feelings she had kept buried for so many years. However, for the first time, she felt she was ready to face it all. Emma looked at the open suitcase in front of her and, with a deep sigh, began to pack her clothes. Each piece placed in the suitcase represented a step toward what she hoped would be a new beginning, one in which she could finally live without the chains of the past. As she closed the suitcase and prepared for the journey, Emma felt that, although the road ahead was uncertain and difficult, she was finally ready to walk it. And with that, a new chapter in her life was about to begin, filled with challenges but also with possibilities for healing and reconciliation. When Emma arrived at her mother's house, she was greeted by a wave of contradictory feelings. The facade of the house, almost unchanged since her childhood, was worn by time but still imposing. As she crossed the threshold, a heavy sense of nostalgia enveloped her. Every piece of furniture, every painting on the wall, carried memories, some sweet, others painful. The familiar smell of the house brought back memories she had buried for years. Evelyn, her mother, was sitting in the armchair that had always been hers, looking smaller and more fragile than Emma remembered. The first few days were filled with silence. The two women, so different yet so alike, moved through the house like ghosts, trying to avoid emotional collisions. Evelyn, who had always been an imposing figure in Emma's life, now seemed withdrawn, as if the illness had stripped her not only of her vitality, but also of her will to continue commanding her daughter's life. The looks they exchanged were full of unspoken words, bottled-up hurt, and the need for an understanding neither knew where to begin. Emma tried to fill her time by diving into chores, but the emptiness and tension between her and her mother were palpable. One day, while organizing some of the house's cabinets, Emma found a box full of old objects, letters, photos, and, more interestingly, some of the materials she used to draw as a child. There were colored pencils, sketchbooks, and even a paint set, all covered in a fine layer of dust, as if they had been waiting for her. Emma hesitated for a moment before picking up one of the sketchbooks and flipping through it. The pages were filled with drawings of landscapes, flowers, and some portraits of people she had imagined. Feeling strangely compelled, Emma decided to rediscover this old hobby. Her first attempt was clumsy, her hand was out of practice, but gradually the act of drawing engulfed her in a way she hadn't anticipated. It was as if, by tracing lines on paper, she were also tracing a path back to herself. Evelyn watched Emma from a distance, saying nothing, but the expression on her face changed. There was a spark of recognition in her eyes, as if she saw in her daughter a reflection of the girl she once was. One night, while Emma was drawing at the dining table, Evelyn quietly approached and sat beside her.
You used to draw so much when you were a child.
Evelyn remarked, her voice weak but filled with a warmth Emma hadn't expected. The simple phrase opened a small crack in the wall of silence that had stood between them. It was a beginning, albeit timid, of something that could become a bridge to reconnection. Even while caring for her mother, Emma knew she couldn't completely distance herself from her professional responsibilities. She organized her work to be done remotely, allowing her to balance caring for Evelyn and leading the project she had been assigned. Surprisingly, this experience of working from home in such an emotionally charged environment brought about a subtle yet profound change in her approach to work. Previously, Emma had been rigid, almost obsessive about her routine and how she managed her tasks. However, the need to balance her mother's care with work required a flexibility she didn't know she possessed. Emma began to delegate more responsibilities, something she had always avoided for fear of losing control. To her surprise, this change not only alleviated some of the pressure on herself, but also strengthened her team's cohesion. Her colleagues began to open up more to her, sharing ideas and challenges, and Emma, in turn, started to truly listen. Emma's new posture did not go unnoticed. Her colleagues noticed the transformation. She was more approachable, more human. The walls that had once isolated her at work began to crumble, and with that, Emma started to be seen differently. The emails and messages she received now came accompanied by more personal questions, and gradually she began to respond with something beyond short, objective replies. This created a new type of connection, one she had never allowed before. Jake, in particular, noticed the change, and during one of the rare times they discussed the project, he casually remarked,
"You seem different, Emma. I think this new phase is doing you good."
Emma smiled at him, feeling an unexpected warmth in her chest. The change she was undergoing within herself was reflected in her work, and the confidence she began to develop in delegating and communicating more opened doors she had never considered possible. She was slowly becoming the leader she never thought she could be, one that balanced efficiency with empathy. The changes at work had a profound impact on Emma's personal life, especially in her relationship with her mother. Evelyn, who at the beginning of Emma's stay seemed distant and reluctant to open up, began to show signs of a vulnerability Emma had never seen. The simple act of being present, of sharing the same space, started to soften the silence between them. The nights in the house became moments of reflection and gradually conversation. One such night, while they were both in the living room, Evelyn began to talk about the past. Without warning, she started sharing stories from when Emma was a child, moments Emma barely remembered but her mother cherished.
You always had such a vivid imagination.
Evelyn said, her voice filled with nostalgia.
I remember how you would run around the house, inventing stories for everything. I wish I had encouraged that more, but back then, I didn't know how.
These words were like a key that unlocked something within Emma. For the first time, she saw her mother not as the rigid and cold figure she had always known, but as a woman who also had her own fears and regrets. The wall that Evelyn had built around herself, just as Emma had, began to crumble, revealing a woman who, despite everything, carried her own pains and vulnerabilities. The conversations between them became more frequent and deeper. Emma began to realize that just like her mother also carried a burden of guilt and regret for not being more affectionate, for not understanding her daughter's emotional needs. Evelyn confessed one particularly emotional night that she had always thought the best way to protect Emma was to teach her to be strong, even if it meant being tough.
I thought I was doing the right thing.
Evelyn admitted, her voice trembling.
But now I see that I pushed you away, and I regret not showing you how much I love you.
These words penetrated deeply into Emma, who for the first time began to forgive her mother, not only for her shortcomings, but also herself for having closed off for so long. The reconciliation between them was not immediate, but the door to understanding and forgiveness was finally opened. The process was slow, but each step forward was an advancement in healing old wounds, leaving space for a more authentic and loving relationship. Emma began to realize that, just as she was transforming her professional life, she was also changing personally. She was finally learning to balance strength with vulnerability, and this was bringing her a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. In her journey of rediscovering her own story and attempting to reconnect with her mother, Emma found something she had always been seeking, even without knowing it: the path to forgive both others and herself. Nights at her mother's house had become a ritual of introspection for Emma. The silent darkness, interrupted only by the sound of the clock on the wall, provided a space where she could confront her thoughts and emotions without distractions. On one of those nights, while searching for a blanket in the living room closet, Emma stumbled upon an old wooden box tucked away at the bottom, almost forgotten. The box had an aged tone and was covered with a fine layer of dust, as if it hadn't been touched in years. Curious, she brought it to the table and, upon opening the lid, found a collection of old letters. The yellowed envelopes, some sealed, others already opened, brought back memories of a simpler yet more painful time. Most of the letters were from distant relatives and long-lost friends who had lost touch. Emma flipped through the letters, feeling nostalgia in every handwritten word. But one letter in particular caught her attention. It was addressed to her, but the envelope had never been opened. Recognizing her father's handwriting, Emma felt a shiver run down her spine. Her hands trembled as she picked up the letter, and with a lump in her throat she opened the envelope. The words she read were like a direct blow to her soul. In the letter, her father expressed deep regret for not being more present in her life, especially during the hardest moments. He admitted his failings and apologized for letting Emma feel alone amid the fights with Evelyn. But more than that, he left a message Emma didn't expect.
Never let the fear of loving and connecting with people stop you from living fully, my dear. I see so much beauty and kindness in you. Don't isolate yourself. You deserve to be happy, and happiness comes from the connections we make.
Those words shattered something inside Emma. The barrier she had built around her emotions, fueled by guilt and fear, began to crumble. Tears started to stream down her face, silent but relentless. It was as if all the weight she had carried for years was finally being released. The pain, the regret, the feeling of abandonment, all surfaced, mixed in a catharsis that left her emotionally exhausted. But at the same time, the letter brought an unexpected relief. Knowing that her father didn't blame her, that he encouraged her to move forward and open her heart, gave Emma a new perspective. For the first time, she felt authorized to forgive herself. And with that, a new determination was born. She knew she had much to rebuild, especially in her relationship with her mother, and that she would need to face her fears to do so. But now, with her father's words as a guide, she felt stronger and ready to continue her healing journey. In the days that followed her discovery of the letter, Emma felt an urgent need to withdraw, to process everything she had unearthed emotionally. She informed her mother that she needed some time alone and drove to a nearby park, a place she visited as a child but hadn't frequented in years. The fresh air and tranquility of the location provided the perfect backdrop for the introspection she so desperately needed. Sitting on a wooden bench, Emma watched the leaves gently falling from the trees, each one reflecting her thoughts, which slowly settled in her mind. Her father's words echoed incessantly.
Don't isolate yourself. You deserve to be happy.
She reflected on how she had allowed fear to shape her life, how every choice she made since his death was influenced by a desire to avoid more pain. Emma thought about her relationship with her mother, the walls they had both built over the years, and how they were finally beginning to open up. And then there was Jake. His presence in her life was unexpected but disturbingly important. Emma realized that despite all the fear she felt in getting close to him, there was something stronger within her, the willingness to try. Interactions with Jake made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years, yet at the same time terrified her. The prospect of opening up to a relationship left her vulnerable. But now, with her father's letter, she began to understand that vulnerability was not a weakness, but an essential part of what it means to live fully. As she walked through the park, Emma made a decision. She was willing to try. Her father's letter gave her the permission she never knew she needed, the permission to love and be loved, to connect with people without fear. The distancing of the past few days was necessary for Emma to reorganize her thoughts and emotions. Now she was ready to return to life, more open and more willing to embrace the risks that love and connections bring. Feeling stronger and clearer about what she needed to do, Emma decided to visit Margaret, her confidant and longtime friend. Margaret had always known how to guide Emma, and now, more than ever, she needed her advice. On her way to Margaret's house, Emma recalled all the times she sought refuge in her friend's wisdom, always receiving back more than she expected. Upon arriving, Margaret greeted her with a warm hug and a smile that spoke more than words could. They sat on the porch, the afternoon sun bathing them in a soft light. Emma shared about the letter she had found, about her father's words and the impact they had on her. Margaret listened in silence, allowing Emma to express herself fully. When Emma finished, still feeling her emotions on the surface, Margaret held her hands and looked deeply into her eyes.
Emma, what your father wrote is true. Fear can be paralyzing, but you have to decide whether you will let it dictate your life. There's no guarantee you won't get hurt, but living with a closed heart is also a form of suffering. You have to give yourself a chance to be happy, to find peace in your relationships, whether with your mother, with Jake, or with yourself.
Margaret's words resonated with Emma in a way she hadn't anticipated. Margaret continued,
But remember, don't rush it. Take your time. The journey to healing is not a race, and you don't have to carry the weight of the world alone. Be kind to yourself.
Emma nodded, feeling an immense relief at realizing she didn't need to have all the answers immediately. Margaret's advice, as always, was simple yet powerful. For the first time, Emma felt she had control over her life. She no longer needed to be a prisoner of the past. She could choose how she wanted to live, and that included taking small, steady steps toward what made her happy. Thanking Margaret with a tight hug, Emma left her friend's house feeling lighter than she had in years. Her father's words, Margaret's support, and her growing affection for Jake were now her guides. She knew she still had much to face, but she also knew she was ready to move forward, without letting fear dictate her steps. Emma was on the right path, and for the first time, she felt that this path, though filled with uncertainties, would lead her to a place of peace and fulfillment. Emma knew that the conversation with Jake could not be postponed for much longer. Ever since she found her father's letter and had that crucial conversation with Margaret, something inside her had changed. She felt an urgent need to be honest with herself and with the people around her, especially with Jake. He deserved an explanation for her absence, and more than that, he deserved a chance to understand the feelings she had been struggling to accept. So after gathering all the courage she could muster, Emma decided to meet him again. They arranged to meet at a small cafe, away from the hustle and bustle of the office. The tranquil environment was perfect for the conversation they knew they needed to have. When Emma arrived, Jake was already there, waiting for her with an expression that mixed anxiety and relief. She sat down, and for a moment the silence between them was thick, laden with everything that had gone unsaid. But then, taking a deep breath, Emma began to speak. She told Jake about the past few days, about her father's letter, and what it had awakened in her. She spoke about the complexity of her relationship with her mother, about the confusing emotions it provoked, and how all of these things were intertwined with the feelings she harbored for him.
I need time.
She said, her voice trembling.
Time to understand what I'm feeling, to process all of this. But I don't want to push you away.
Jake listened to every word attentively, his eyes fixed on hers. He knew that what was about to come would change everything between them, and then, with a nervousness he rarely showed, he made the decision to open up.
Emma,
He began, his voice soft yet firm.
I fell in love with you from that first coffee we had together. I know it might seem rushed, but it's the truth. I see in you incredible strength, even when you think you're breaking.
Jake's confession hit Emma like a wave, bringing a whirlwind of emotions. He continued,
I'm willing to wait as long as it takes, but I want you to know that I want to be by your side, whether as a friend or something more. What matters to me is that you feel safe without any pressures. And if you need more time to take care of your mother and yourself, you can continue working remotely. I want you to do what's best for you.
Emma, surprised and touched, felt a mix of confusion and relief. It was rare for her to hear such sincere words, and even rarer to believe them.
I don't know what to say, Jake. This is a lot. I just know I need time.
she said, her voice shaky but sincere. Jake smiled softly, nodding.
I understand, and I'll be here, whatever path you decide to take.
The mutual acceptance that time was necessary was a significant turning point for both of them. They weren't rushing to define labels or expectations. Instead, they were giving each other the freedom to let the relationship flourish at its own pace, which represented an important maturation for both Emma and Jake. And Jake's support for remote work provided Emma with the peace she needed to continue caring for her mother without the pressure of always being present at the office. In the days that followed, Emma and Jake began to build a new foundation for their relationship. They decided that before anything else, they needed to strengthen the friendship that was already forming. Without the pressures of an immediate romantic relationship, they found a natural comfort in spending time together. Jake, realizing the importance of this for Emma, suggested they do simple activities, like walking in the city's parks or browsing the local bookstore. All of this, of course, was fitted around Emma's flexible work hours as she continued to work remotely. These shared moments began to have a profound impact on Emma. She felt more at ease, more open to sharing stories from her childhood, things that had once been painful but now, in Jake's company, felt less threatening. They talked about books, movies, and dreams they had for the future, without the need to hide the more difficult parts of their lives. Jake, for his part, began to reveal more of himself, sharing his own insecurities and the struggles he had faced over the years. Each walk, each conversation, was a brick in the construction of something solid between them. Emma began to realize that, no matter what happened, she would always have Jake as a loyal friend. This brought her a sense of security she had never experienced before. The bond between them deepened, not because of a romance, but because of a mutual understanding, a respect for the time and space each needed. This new foundation of friendship allowed Emma to start trusting herself and others more. She allowed herself to relax, enjoying the small moments of happiness that came from simply being in the company of someone who understood her. And remote work, far from being a burden, became a blessing, allowing her to maintain the balance between her responsibilities and the time she spent with Jake. The transformation this brought to Emma's life was significant. For the first time in a long time, she felt she was in control, not of external circumstances, but of how she reacted to them. This gave her the confidence that, whatever the future held, she would have the strength to face it. The new approach that Emma adopted in her life began to reflect in other areas. Besides her growing friendship with Jake, she reconnected with Margaret and started attending social gatherings she had previously avoided. At work, the confidence she developed from dealing with emotional challenges allowed her to take the lead on projects more naturally, even while working remotely. Her colleagues noticed her constant presence, albeit virtual, and it did not go unnoticed. Little by little, Emma began to realize that her life was expanding in ways she had never imagined. The simple act of having an honest conversation with her mother or completing a difficult task at work now brought her a sense of accomplishment and joy. This rediscovery of happiness in simple aspects of life was deeply moving for her. The woman who once lived in the shadow of guilt and fear was now allowing herself to dream again, something she had set aside for so long. Emma also rediscovered hobbies she had abandoned, like reading and gardening. She spent hours reading books that inspired her or tending to the plants in her mother's garden. These moments, once seen as mere distractions, were now sources of peace and satisfaction. She was happy to be able to reconcile remote work with these moments of personal pleasure. Each task completed, each new plant that bloomed, was a small triumph on her journey of self-discovery. The transformation in Emma was palpable. She was learning to find happiness in the little things, to value moments of quiet, and to celebrate the small victories of everyday life. This represented a complete turnaround in her life. Emma, who once isolated herself out of fear of suffering, was now open to the possibilities life offered. She was open to love, friendship, and above all, to life itself, with all its uncertainties and wonders. And so, as Emma's journey continued, she began to realize that no matter what the future held, she had found something more valuable than anything else: the ability to live fully, to connect with herself and others, and to embrace the joys, big and small, that life had to offer. Returning to work after the intense period Emma spent caring for her mother and rebuilding her own life brought a new sense of normalcy. A normalcy that was, however, completely different from what she had experienced before. Remote work, which had initially been a necessity, had become a testament to her ability to lead and make decisions under pressure. Now, back in the office, Emma felt like a different person, stronger and more confident. Soon into her first week back, Emma was called to a meeting with the director of her company. She felt a mix of anxiety and curiosity as she climbed the stairs to the conference room. Upon entering, she was greeted with a warm smile and a compliment that left her speechless.
Emma, your performance on the remote project was exceptional. Not only did you keep the team motivated, but you also delivered results beyond expectations. Therefore, we have decided to promote you to the position of project manager. We believe you are more than ready to lead a team full-time.
The news took her by surprise. Emma had always excelled at her job, but the promotion was recognition not only of her technical skills but also of her personal growth. She accepted the new challenge with gratitude and a sense of accomplishment. It was as if all the pieces of her life were starting to fall into place. Taking on the new position was a challenge, but Emma found renewed confidence in her abilities. Utilizing the lessons she learned during her personal journey, she led her team with an empathy she had never shown before. She understood what it meant to face difficulties, which made her a more approachable and understanding leader. Her colleagues began to admire her not just for her competence, but for her humanity. And, with this confidence, her friendship with Jake also continued to flourish. Jake was there every step of the way, supporting her silently, without pressuring her. Emma felt that she had finally found a balance between her personal and professional life. Now she no longer hid behind spreadsheets and tasks, but used her experience to guide others. Emma knew there were still challenges ahead, but the promotion represented a new phase in her life, where she could lead with confidence and continue to grow. Inspired by the changes in her life and the growth she had experienced, Emma began to feel a need to give something back to the world. Her father's words, to never let fear dictate her life, still echoed in her mind, leading her to seek ways to help others facing similar challenges. Emma began attending support groups where she shared her story and listened to others. It was an important step, not only for her, but also for those who benefited from her wisdom and experience. During one of these sessions, Emma decided to bring her mother. Evelyn, still in recovery, was reluctant, but deep down knew she needed to reconnect with the world and her daughter. During the session, after Emma spoke about her healing journey, something unexpected happened. Evelyn, who had remained silent until then, asked to speak. With a trembling voice, she began to tell a story Emma had never heard before.
After John's death, I wrote a letter to Emma.
Evelyn began, looking at her daughter with teary eyes.
But I never had the courage to give it to her. In the letter, I asked for forgiveness. Forgiveness for everything I did and failed to do. And, more importantly, I told Emma not to let fear dictate her life, just as your father advised her. I wanted her to know that despite all my mistakes, I always loved her and always loved John. I just didn't know how to show it.
The revelation was a blow to Emma's heart, but not in a painful way. Rather, it felt liberating. Evelyn took a crumpled letter from her bag and handed it to her daughter. Emma's hands trembled as she opened the envelope and began to read. Her mother's words were filled with regret and love, something Emma had always longed to hear but never had the chance. Evelyn confessed to the weight she had carried for years, wishing her daughter could forgive her for her father's loss, for the coldness that distanced them, and for the years of silence. Reading the letter was both devastating and healing at the same time. Emma cried, but this time her tears were not only of sadness, they were of relief, acceptance, and above all, of a forgiveness she was finally ready to grant. Her mother's letter brought a closure Emma hadn't even realized she needed, but now that she had it, it offered her a peace she had always sought. From that moment on, Emma knew she was ready to move forward, leaving the past where it belonged. With the closure provided by her mother's letter, Emma felt as if a great weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders. She had faced her greatest fears, dealt with the pains of the past, and now was ready to embrace the future. Her new position at work, where she led a team that respected and admired her, was a direct reflection of the balance she had found in her personal life. Emma continued to nurture her friendships, staying close to Margaret, who had always been a guide for her in the toughest moments. Her relationship with Jake also evolved naturally. They began to explore the possibility of a romantic relationship, but without haste. Emma knew that while the feelings between them were strong, it was important not to rush. They both decided to let the future unfold at its own pace, enjoying every moment together, free from the pressures that would have suffocated any attempt at connection in the past. The peace Emma felt was something new, a sensation she had learned to value more than anything else. The nights she spent in the garden, tending to her plants, or the quiet moments reading a book beside Jake, were for her the greatest rewards of her journey. She had found joy in the little things, something she never thought possible, especially considering the emotional weight she had carried for so long. Now, Emma was at peace with her past. The pain and guilt that had haunted her for so many years had finally dissipated, making way for a new understanding of what it meant to live fully. She knew that life would still bring challenges, but she was more than prepared to face them. And with Jake by her side, she felt even more empowered. Emma's renaissance was not just a change in her professional or personal life. It was a complete transformation of her worldview and her perception of herself. She learned the importance of opening up, allowing herself to love and be loved, and embracing life's uncertainties with grace. Emma's journey, filled with pain, growth, and healing, culminated in a point where she could finally look at herself with pride and say,
I made it.
And so, as the sun set on another peaceful day, Emma smiled, knowing that although the path to get there had been difficult, she had emerged stronger, more complete, and ready to live life with an open heart. She finally understood that true balance comes from accepting oneself, with all their imperfections, and embracing the love she found, both within and outside of herself. Months had passed since Emma began her journey of transformation. The wounds of the past, once seeming incurable, were now scars that told a story of overcoming and growth. On a sunny Saturday, Emma decided to visit the park where she used to run, a place that had once served as a refuge to escape her own thoughts. As she walked along the familiar trails, she felt a wave of nostalgia mixed with an odd sense of peace. She knew that somehow, that park was the perfect setting to symbolically close the chapter of her healing journey. After a few minutes of walking, Emma found a quiet spot beneath a large tree where sunlight filtered gently through the leaves, creating a serene environment. There, she sat on the ground, feeling the earth beneath her fingers, and took out 2 letters she had brought with her. The first was the letter from her father, the one she had found months ago, which had given her the necessary push to start living fully. The second was a letter she had written to herself the night before. With steady hands, Emma opened the letter she wrote, feeling that the words inside were the perfect closure for that chapter of her life. In the letter, she described all the growth she had experienced, from the moment she decided to face her fears to the point where she finally felt at peace with herself. She wrote about the importance of forgiving, allowing herself to love, and not letting fear control her. For Emma, that letter represented not only the farewell to her old self, but also a commitment to the new chapter she was about to start. With both letters in hand, Emma decided to create a time capsule. She dug a small hole beneath the tree, carefully placed the letters inside, and before covering the hole, she made one last silent reflection on her journey. Burying those letters was like burying the parts of herself that she was ready to leave behind, the guilt, the fear, the loneliness. With a deep sigh, Emma covered the hole, knowing that in that simple act, She was symbolically bidding farewell to her old self and welcoming a new life full of possibilities. The next morning, the soft light of dawn flooded Emma's apartment as her phone buzzed with a message. It was Jake, inviting her for a morning walk. Ever since they began exploring the possibility of a romantic relationship, their walks had become a tradition, a moment of connection without pressure, where they could simply be themselves. Emma, feeling light and optimistic, accepted the invitation with a smile. They met at the park, the same one where Emma had buried the time capsule. The morning was fresh and clear, and the air seemed full of promises of new beginnings. As they walked side by side, Jake casually mentioned a new job opportunity that had arisen for him in another city.
What do you think?
He asked, his tone relaxed, as if he were asking about something simple. Emma paused for a moment, contemplating the question. There was no anxiety in her response, just a genuine curiosity about the future. She smiled, feeling at peace with the uncertainty.
I think what matters is that we're okay with whatever comes.
She replied, her voice filled with serenity. Jake smiled back, relieved by the lightness of the conversation.
I agree,
he said, gently taking Emma's hand. They continued walking, needing little to say. The connection between them was deep, based on respect and mutual understanding. At the end of the walk, they stopped at a point where the view of the park was most beautiful, and without saying a word, Jake leaned in and kissed her softly. The kiss was calm, unhurried, yet filled with meaning. When they pulled away, both knew that no matter what the future held, they would be okay because they had found something true and lasting in each other. Embracing, they looked around the park, both aware that they were beginning a new chapter in their lives. There was no need to rush. The present was enough, and the future, though uncertain, seemed filled with promises. Back at her apartment after the walk, Emma sat in the living room chair, holding an old photo of her family. The image, which once brought her pain and longing, now filled her with a deep sense of gratitude. She gazed at the smiling faces of her parents and herself, a child full of dreams and hopes. Instead of feeling sadness for what she had lost, Emma felt a wave of recognition for everything those experiences had taught her. Over time, each challenge, each loss, each moment of loneliness transformed into something positive, something that shaped her into the strong and resilient woman she was now. Emma realized that without those difficult moments, she might never have discovered the true extent of her strength and capacity to love. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and for the first time, felt completely free from the shackles of the past. Opening her eyes again, Emma smiled at the photo and carefully placed it in a special spot on the shelf. That photo, once tucked away in a box at the back of the closet, now had a place of honor, symbolizing not only the past, but also the path that brought her to the present. She stood up and walked to the balcony where the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The world before her was full of new possibilities, and Emma was more than ready to explore them. She knew that the future would bring new challenges, but now, with the inner peace she had found, she was prepared for anything that came her way. Standing on the balcony, watching the new day unfold, Emma smiled, feeling whole. The silent transformation that had occurred within her was now her greatest achievement, and the future, though uncertain, seemed bright and full of promises. Emma finally found peace by accepting her past and opening herself up to love and new possibilities. Her journey shows us that, despite the pain and obstacles, forgiveness and the courage to reconnect with others can transform our lives. We all have scars, but they don't define us. We are defined by the choices we make. And you? Are you ready to face your fears and open your heart to what life has to offer? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, hit the like button, and comment your thoughts about the story. And don't miss the next recommended video. Just click on the card that appears on the screen. Thank you for watching.